If you want to understand what is happening to the dollar, stop looking for one dramatic collapse moment. That is not how systems like this usually break. People want a clean movie scene, a treaty torn up on camera, a president making a shocking announcement, a market crash. So obvious that even the people who never paid attention suddenly understand that a chapter ended. Real monetary transitions are rarely that kind. They are slower, messier, more political, more psychological, and much more dangerous precisely because the public does not feel the shift clearly until years after it has already begun. That is the mother line. The petrodollar system is not ending because one paper expired. It is weakening because the old machine is no longer as automatic, trusted, and unified as it used to be. That difference matters enormously. Most people have no idea what the petrodollar really was. They hear the phrase and imagine some secret conspiracy. It was not magic. It was an arrangement after the United States cut the dollar loose from gold. The country still needed a way to preserve deep global demand for its currency. Saudi Arabia agreeing to sell oil in dollars solved that problem. The world needed oil, therefore the world needed dollars. And once oil exporters accumulated those dollars, a large share of that money flowed back into dollar assets, especially treasury debt in exchange. America provided military protection and strategic backing to the Gulf order. That was the deal. Not mystical, just powerful. And once the world must keep your currency in order to buy the most important industrial commodity on earth, your deficits behave differently, your borrowing behaves differently, your currency behaves differently. Your room for fiscal sloppiness becomes larger than a normal country's room would ever be. That is what privilege looks like in monetary form. Now here's where people start thinking lazily. They hear that Saudi Arabia sold some oil in yuan, or that the UAE wants more flexibility, or that more countries are talking about de-dollarization. And they jump to one of two ridiculous conclusions. Either the dollar is finished tomorrow or nothing matters because the dollar is still dominant today. Both responses are childish. The world does not work in clean absolutes like that. The more serious truth lives in the middle. The dollar is still dominant. The dollar is still deeply embedded. The dollar is still the largest reserve currency by far. But the automaticity of the old machine is weaker than before, and in systems this large margin changes matter. That is the first mechanism I want you to understand. I call it the monopoly fade. The real strength of the petrodollar was never that no one could imagine an alternative. Its real strength was that the default was so embedded, no one had to think very hard about seeking one oil in dollars. Reserves in dollars, recycling into treasury assets. End of story. That kind of automatic behavior is more powerful than official declarations because it turns habit into structure. But once the habit weakens, the structure weakens too. That is why the UAE leaving OPEC matters beyond the surface. The shallow story is about cartel politics. The deeper story is about incentive drift. The UAE wants more flexibility. It wants more room to produce, more room to negotiate, more room to align its own interests without subordinating every move to an old collective framework that does not end the oil world. It does signal that internal cohesion is becoming harder to maintain, and cohesion was part of the strength. When the oil world moved together, the old settlement order looked stronger. When producers increasingly want optionality, the settlement system also begins loosening around the edges. That is how big arrangements decay, not through one death certificate, through changing incentives. This is the second mechanism. I call it settlement drift. A monetary regime does not need a formal funeral to weaken. It only needs enough important participants deciding that they would prefer more optionality than before, more bilateral trade, more local currency settlement, more strategic distance from one dominant reserve system, more ways to buy and sell without automatically passing everything through the same channel. That drift is already happening. China has pushed aggressively for more yuan settlement in energy. Saudi Arabia opened the door to that possibility. India and the Gulf have explored local currency deals. Russia, under sanctions pressure, was forced to move away from the old framework much faster than it otherwise would have. Each individual change looks manageable in isolation. Collectively, they tell you something much bigger. The road still exists, but there are more side roads now, and that is what matters. Now we come to the most important issue of all, And this is where most people still have not adjusted their thinking. The dollar is no longer only a reserve asset. It is increasingly also a geopolitical liability in the minds of other states. The reason is simple. Once Russian reserves were frozen, every central bank in the world received the same message at the same time. Your reserve assets are not purely neutral if they sit inside the political and legal reach of another empire. That realization changed everything, because once a country sees dollar reserves not only as financial assets but also as potentially conditional assets, it begins asking a different question. Not, is the dollar useful? Of course it is useful. The real question becomes, how much dependence is too much dependence? If the system can be weaponized against me later, that is the real fracture. This is the third mechanism, I call it reserve distrust. A central bank does not need to hate America to want less concentration in dollar reserves. It only needs to understand that geopolitical neutrality inside a fiat reserve system is not guaranteed forever. Once that thought enters the room, behavior changes, not theatrically, institutionally, slowly, quietly, consistently. That is why I care so much about gold here. Gold is not rising because the world suddenly became nostalgic. Gold is rising because central banks are behaving like institutions that want at least part of their reserve wealth outside the political perimeter of any one country. That is a very different story from what most people tell themselves. They still think gold is just an inflation hedge. That is too narrow. Gold is also a trust hedge, a neutrality hedge, a reserve, diversification hedge, a sanction hedge, a debasement hedge. It becomes more important when the monetary order looks less politically clean than before. This is the fourth mechanism, I call it the trust meter. Gold rises not only when inflation rises. Gold rises when trust falls. Trust in fiscal discipline, trust in reserve neutrality. Trust in the future purchasing power of paper claims. Trust in the willingness of governments to restrain themselves when borrowing gets politically easier than honesty. That is why central banks buying gold matters so much more than retail investors shouting about gold online. Institutions do not move like tourists. If central banks are accumulating gold at unusual levels, they are not doing it for drama. They are doing it because the architecture of the reserve system looks less comfortable than before. That is a serious signal. Now let me say something important. I am not arguing that the dollar disappears. I am not arguing that America loses all reserve privilege next year. I am not arguing that the yuan or some other currency simply takes over in a clean handoff. That is not how real transitions work. The alternatives to the dollar also have flaws. China has capital controls. Europe lacks a unified sovereign safe asset on the same scale. Gold has no yield and no government backing. Bitcoin is still far too politically unstable for central bank scale reserve management. So no, the throne does not vanish overnight, but the throne does not need to vanish for the old advantage to erode. That is the fifth mechanism, I call it privilege decay. For decades, America enjoyed something close to a monetary cheat code. The world needed dollars. Energy reinforced that need. Reserve managers reinforced that need. Treasury recycling reinforced that need. That gave the United States much more room to borrow, spend, and inflate than a normal country could ever hope to get away with. If global demand for dollars becomes even slightly less automatic over time, then that privilege becomes even slightly less powerful over time. That may sound small. It is not small. A giant system can survive small erosions for years while still looking dominant. But the compounding effect of reduced demand at the margin, reduced reserve concentration, and rising diversification behavior eventually starts changing the cost of debt, the credibility of the currency, and the tolerance the world has for endless issuance. That is the part I want people to see. Now, let us bring this down to the investor level, because this is where most people either panic or get lazy. Panic says, sell everything, buy gold, the dollar is over. Lazy says, the dollar still exists, therefore nothing matters. Both will probably lose money in their own way. The smarter response is more disciplined. First, understand what gold is and is not. Gold is not a productive asset. In the same way a business is productive, it does not grow earnings, it does not launch new products, it does not build factories. but it does something else very well. It sits there outside the political discretion of any single central bank in a world where reserve trust is weakening. That matters. Second, understand that global diversification is no longer optional decoration for an American investor who wants to think seriously. You do not need to abandon the United States. America still has the deepest capital markets, some of the strongest companies, and extraordinary entrepreneurial force. But if more countries are trying to strengthen local systems, reduce dollar dependence, and build parallel channels, then international exposure deserves more respect than it got when American exceptionalism looked unstoppable. Third, understand energy and defense through a more adult lens. If the old oil order becomes less stable, energy security rises in importance. If the world becomes more fragmented, military and logistics spending do not become less relevant, they become more relevant. You do not need to like that morally for it to matter financially. Fourth, do not confuse broad American equity exposure with blindness. The dollar may weaken at the margin and the S&P 500 can still do well. In fact, if the reserve regime becomes less stable, some of the best businesses in America may still be among the strongest owners of pricing power, scale, and productivity. The point is not to abandon the United States. The point is to stop building a portfolio that assumes the old petrodollar machine will keep functioning with the same effortless global obedience it did before. That is overconfident. This is the sixth mechanism. I call it the hedge stack principle. In a world where reserve trust is weakening, no single asset solves everything. Gold gives you monetary neutrality. International exposure gives you broader currency and growth diversification. Energy gives you exposure to strategic necessity. Defense gives you exposure to geopolitical spending and procurement. Broad American equities still give you participation in the most powerful corporate economy on earth. Each piece solves a different part of the problem. That is how adults hedge a structural shift, not with one heroic all in prediction, but with a stack of positions that all benefit in different ways if the old order becomes less stable. Now let me end with a point I think matters most. The public keeps waiting for proof that the petrodollar is over. They want the headline to make the transition official. They want a clean binary. But systems this large are rarely kind enough to give you that clarity in time. By the time the obituary feels obvious, most of the smart capital is already repositioned. That is always how it works. The people who protect themselves earliest are not the ones with a crystal ball. They are the ones who understand that big systems weaken first in behavior, then in incentives, then in flows, and only much later in public language. That is where we are now. The dollar still matters. The dollar still dominates. But the machine that once made dollar demand feel automatic is no longer as unified, unquestioned, and politically neutral as it was. That is enough for central banks to buy gold, enough for oil settlement to drift, enough for reserve managers to diversify, enough for serious investors to stop treating this like a fringe conversation, because the real opportunity is not in waiting for the system to fully collapse. The real opportunity is in seeing the old privilege erode early enough to own what rises when trust gets thinner, neutrality gets more valuable, and the world starts paying more for monetary options it used to take for granted.